Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. I'm always genuinely thrilled to find another fabulous Australian author kicking goals with brilliant books, and none so more than my next guest. Karen Turner is an award-winning Melbourne-based writer who has authored many short stories along with an incredible trilogy of sweeping historical romances, the latest of which I have just had the pleasure of reading. This book is called Stormbird and chronicles the life of young mother and war widow Jessica Barrow, whose life on an old farm outside of Leeds is suddenly and irrevocably altered when in 1941 she finds an injured and gravely ill German Luftwaffe pilot hiding in her barn. It's an incredible high-stakes story filled with terrifying tension as Jessica battles her convictions and risks being jailed for treason and losing her children for harbouring an enemy of the state. But at its core, it's a powerful love story, a story of forbidden love that had me completely enthralled for every one of its 600 plus pages. A Downton Abbey-meets-Outlander sweeping saga that I absolutely loved. And for that reason, I'm delighted to welcome Karen to the podcast today. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Claudine.
Congratulations on this thoroughly captivating book. I love historical romance, and I'm sure people will be sick of hearing that I'm a devoted Outlander fan. But this book certainly had echoes of some of the themes in Outlander, along with a strong Downton Abbey flavour being set in the north of England. So can you tell me a little bit about your inspiration for writing this story?
Well, my mother and grandmother were from Yorkshire, from Leeds, and my mum was born during the bombings. So that was one of the times that I set for the book, 1941 in Yorkshire. And my character's home is actually set in a village on the outskirts of Leeds. Now, the real village is actually called Otley, and it's where I lived with my grandmother many years ago. In my book, I've called it Woolston, but it is actually Otley, and the streets and the market and the shops and the pubs and everything are exactly as they are today. As I mentioned, my mum was born during the bombings in Leeds, so I grew up with stories about deprivation and what it was like for her to play in the rubble of people's homes and cellars where people would previously just store things and they were damp and only good for rats. It became people's homes when their real homes were bombed out. And this is how my mum grew up. And my grandmother, who lost her husband very early on in the war, so my mum never knew her father. My grandmother drove an ambulance around Leeds helping to rescue people who were wounded or worse during the bombings. So I have a very strong family connection to that time, but also a strong connection personally with that region of England. And many years ago, I went and lived with my grandma in Otley, and my husband proposed to me there, and we visit regularly. And but for a very elderly cat who I'm looking after at the moment, I'd probably be there now. So, a very strong connection. I just love it. Being over there as a young girl who I'd never travelled before, I'd never even been to Sydney, going to England and seeing this, my eyes were shiny and wide and I was bedazzled, and the stories just started to flow, and the homes and the stately old mansions that we got to visit, and the countryside and the villages and the camaraderie of the people. I could only imagine what it must have been like during wartime, and the stories just started piling up in me. I couldn't wait to start writing them.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, I know I outlined the plot briefly in my introduction, but can you tell us a little bit more about Stormbird?
Stormbird for me was it is a tying up of my two previous books, although it can be read independently. To me, it fills in a lot of the gaps that were left with the first book, Torn, and then the sequel, Inviolate. Stormbird was intended to be the third one that tied up all the loose ends. However, I wrote it so that it could be read independently by people who wanted a different kind of story set in a different time. And When I started writing Stormbird, the themes of forbidden love, and we all love a forbidden love, but forbidden love that had the element of danger in it became so strong that I grew into the story as my characters evolved and became the characters that they became. It's not contrived to say that when you start getting deep with a book as you're writing it, the stories, the characters tend to take on a life of their own. And my characters certainly did as Jessica and Anton's relationship grew, and I could see where this could really take the story forward because there is the danger. During wartime, to harbour the enemy was worse than being the enemy because people could understand the concept of an enemy, but they couldn't understand the concept of their own kind supporting or harbouring the enemy. My character, Jessica, had lost her husband at the beginning of the war, and she comes to a point where she asks herself if her husband had been rescued by a German woman, would she have wanted that German woman to hand him over, or would she have wanted the German woman to nurse him back to health? And when she asked herself that question, the answer was fairly clear that she was going to help this German Luftwaffe officer. And despite the authorities and the danger of the authorities finding out, she chose to do that, and with the consequences that I'm not going to tell you because people have to read the book for themselves.
Yes, indeed. Karen, I've interviewed a number of very clever Australian authors just like you, authors who find inspiration for their books in the lives of ordinary people who in times of war manage extraordinary feats. Not only do they survive the horrors of the war inflicted, but also bravely put their own lives at risk to help others, as you've mentioned. That kind of courage is amply on show in Stormbird. It's not just one person, but many who look beyond the uniform that the fugitive German Luftwaffe pilot wore and see a human being, a person like them, with the same fears, hopes and needs. In many ways, it made what Jessica had to do easier, but harder at the same time, didn't it?
Well, it did, but I also wanted to show that it wasn't all sweet and roses right from the beginning, because there was suspicion and fear from both of them, both Jessica and Anton. I mean, from Anton's perspective, he was wounded. He was at death's door. He was in a foreign place, far away from his family. He knew nobody. And there was this woman who could turn him over to the authorities. She could probably shoot him and claim that he had attacked her and get away with it. He had fears and suspicion. And likewise, she had fear and suspicion. Her father had fought during the war, First World War, and all she'd heard growing up was about, how the Germans were this one beast that were out to destroy the world, when in fact it wasn't the case. And Jessica gradually came to learn that this German person that was living in her house was educated, he was kind, he was generous, he was afraid, he was lonely, he was everything that she was. And as those barriers of bigotry and ignorance started to come down, the relationship started to come up, and they started to support one another and look after one another and defend one another. Similarly, I want to point out, a lot of people have spoken to me about my characters in Stormbird, but nobody has actually asked about the children. Jessica has 2 young children, and they play quite a part as well.
Yes, they do.
I've tried to show that they're quite naive in terms of, what's really going on in the world and why they had to be quiet about this man living in their house. But they also came to know him and love him, and with its own problems, they started to pick up a bit of German language. And while they thought that was fun, Jessica was terrified that they might speak it outside the house, and all these little things going on. And I tried to think what it would really be like on a day-to-day basis.
It really put the human face on war up front and centre for us to think about.
Thank you. That was what I had in mind.
Yeah. Now, you captured the Northern England dialect or speech inflection so beautifully in this book, not to mention the captain's German, something that's not very easy to do, but it made your characters come alive on the page for me. So tell me, what research did you have to do to give these characters such authenticity?
My grandmother, a very, very Yorkshire lady, had a very, very broad Yorkshire accent, and she spoke the dialect. So I grew up hearing that accent, hearing the dialect. And my grandmother she was a bit mischievous, and she wasn't above speaking in dialect if she didn't want anybody understanding her. So the dialect is something I just knew. My mother, to my ear, never had an accent, but to people outside of our families, she did have a strong accent as well. And she occasionally used to come out with bits of dialect herself. There's a comment in the book where Jessica is trying to strip a wet jumper off her son, and she says, "Arms up for dipping bread."
Yep.
And my mum used to say that to me all the time. Now, my editor lives in Reading, in just outside of London, and she said to me, "Oh, what's this all about?" And I said, "Well, that's what my mum used to say to me. You know, it just means put your arms up." And she said, "Oh, you should take it out. Nobody would know what that means." And I said, No, it's staying in because it's authentic. That's what my mother used to say. With regard to the German, I knew a little bit of German just from, childhood German that I had learned at school and what have you. But I was fortunate enough that occasionally I travelled to Italy and I do some volunteer work in an animal shelter there. And there are a lot of visitors to that centre and volunteers from all around the world. And I became really good friends with a German lady. And when she went back to Germany and I came home to Australia, we kept in touch. And I said to her, "Look, I'm writing this book. I've written out some German dialect. I'm not sure whether I've got it right, what the spelling is. Nobody can trust Google." So I sent her a spreadsheet of all my German dialect, what I thought it meant, what I intended it to mean, and asked her if she could correct it and make sure it was real. So she did all of that for me. So I was quite confident that my German dialect, my German speech in there is accurate.
These were difficult times for women, and you threw quite a number of very challenging obstacles across Jessica's path. Was this a deliberate choice on your part, or more about the era in which Jessica lived?
It wasn't deliberate at first. I really wanted to show how Jessica early on in the book she's afraid, she's uncertain, she's never had to look after herself. She went straight from living at home with mum and dad to being a married woman and then a mother and a wife. Until the time that her husband went to war and he passed away, she'd never had to do a lot of things for herself. So a lot of it was her learning along the way. So I've tried to show how, she's become stronger, she's become more confident, she's made decisions on her own that normally she wouldn't have had to make. And there is a scene in it where she goes to confront her bank manager and he's quite derogatory and suggests she might have a brother or a father that could come and help out instead of him dealing with her. And she stands up for herself. And as I was writing that, I thought, it wasn't so long ago that women had that. It wasn't so long ago that here in Australia, I'm talking maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was like that. I remember, good heavens, it would have been maybe about 30 years ago, I went along to have a look at a house that I probably couldn't afford to buy, but hoped that I could. And I happened to take my boyfriend with me at the time. And the salesman only wanted to talk to my boyfriend. And even though my boyfriend said to him, "It's not my house, you need to talk to Karen," he kept referring and directing all his conversation to my boyfriend. So in the end, I walked out.
Yeah.
And that was only 30 years ago.
It still happens.
Yeah, exactly. We are gradually, as women, overcoming it, but it's still lurking there, isn't it?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. It was easy to forget the danger that Anton posed to Jessie and her family during their everyday interactions on the farm. It was so rural and so idyllic in many ways. But as time went on, and presumably the war, the anti-German sentiment seemed to become stronger and people seemed more willing to provide intel on Jessie's movements to the authorities. Neighbours were turning on each other. People who had known Jessie her whole life could have turned on her. How much of this sentiment did you find in your research?
I didn't know a lot of it from my mum and my grandma. Mum certainly would have been too young to know anything about that. Grandma's anecdotes about the war were more about how everybody was pulling together, everybody was supporting one another, everybody was partying at night because you didn't know if you were going to see the next day. And she said, but for the war, life was great, but for the war. So for me, a lot of it came down to research, and I'm sure many of the people who listen to you would be familiar with some of the photos that we've all seen of women being stoned and had their heads shaved for fraternising with the Germans. Women, particularly in France. I've seen photos of some women, they were stripped naked and paraded down the street by their fathers. and with the locals throwing muck at them because they dared to fraternise with a German. Well, who knows what the circumstances of that was? Maybe the woman was starving, they were still judged. And during the research of this, I was quite shocked and quite upset by the way people can treat one another. And during that research, I wanted to show how, to an extent, some of the other characters in Jessica's life tried to shelter her from that because they knew that she was getting in way too deep with this fellow. However, at some point they had to tell her that she was running a great risk and he had to go. He can't stay. The authorities are going to get him. You're going to be ostracised by the community. You're going to be, they're not going to welcome him. What are you thinking? And I really needed to get that across. And a lot of research. No, you know what? It wasn't a lot of research because it was there. I started looking at some images and going onto sites online and libraries, and it was all there, how women were treated in that time. So, yeah, it was traumatic, actually, some of the images you can see.
So the title Stormbird is a translation of the German word Sturmvogel. Now, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correct.
Stormvogel.
That was what the Germans called the Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter bomber aircraft used by the Luftwaffe in the latter part of the war. And Anton was a test pilot for this aircraft, wasn't he?
That's right. And you know what? I'll tell you a secret. Don't tell anybody. But when I started researching the aircraft that the Germans were using, and I knew that they had the Luftwaffe had the Messerschmitt 132, I think it was, but that was more of a carrier plane. It wasn't a fighter, it wasn't a bomber. And I knew that they had been testing and trying to build a high-speed bombing plane, because at the time you could have a fighter jet or you could have a bomber, but you couldn't have both because of the weight of the bombs. So when I started doing the research into this newfangled fighter jet that could also carry bombs that the Germans were researching and developing, I discovered that the Germans liked to give all their planes nicknames, and the nickname for this one was Stormbird, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. It's like, that has to be the title of my book. So then I wrote it so that Anton was a test pilot for that plane, and that's what he was doing at the time that he was flying over England. And there was a comment in the book where he says to Jessica, well, the reason why was because, if we're going to test bombs, we prefer to do it over enemy territory. And she says, oh, well, how thrifty of you. So I kind of wrote that story around it because I loved the word. I loved the name Stormbird, and the Sturmvogel that they called it. It just seemed to work.
So I guess that begs the question, was Anton's crash landing in the north of England based on an actual incident?
Not to my knowledge. However, I refer to places like the POW camps. They did exist in those locations. The authorities and the Home Guard, they all existed. Everything existed except that Anton, his crash landing, was all a fiction.
So Anton's crash landing was of particular interest to the English authorities in Stormbird, not only because he was a German fugitive, but presumably because the Allied forces wanted to gain some intelligence on this aviation design. Is that right?
Yes, it is. At the time, it was like a race to the finish between the English developers, the British developers of planes, and the Germans. Now, the British knew that the Germans were developing this high-speed bomber. And when they found the wreckage, that was true. In my fiction, when they found the wreckage, it sparked a frenzy of, we've got to get hold of it and let's get the pilot too, because imagine what he could tell us. Yeah. So that was one of the reasons why, despite the fact that he is a German fugitive, they really, really wanted him because he had information that they really desperately needed. But the Germans did win that race with the Messerschmitt. They just didn't bring it into service as early as they could have. And that was because there was some discussion about what they wanted to do with it and how they wanted to do it. And as a result, they didn't bring it into service until much later. And by then, the war was already lost from that perspective. Yeah.
I guess I want to know where you got your inspiration for Anton, the captain, or Mr. Bird, as he's variously known throughout the novel.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know where Jessica came from. I don't know where any of my characters come from. They just pop up in my head. And my husband says to me, he can always tell when I'm plotting. I don't ever write my plot down. I always just see it. and I'll sit sometimes for ages just staring at the wall, and my husband says, I won't disturb you because I can see you watching a movie. And it's just a movie rolling out in my head, and as the story develops, I see the characters and I start to hear their voices and I see the setting, and Anton just came to me just same way as Jessica and her children and the other characters in the book and all my books. It's just the way they've come about.
Fantastic.
I spend a lot of time with imaginary friends, you know.
Well, as a writer, I don't expect anything else.
No, that's right. Every now and we bob up for air and think, oh, hello.
Oh, that's brilliant. Now, suffice it to say, there is a paranormal element to this story that I found fascinating. And without giving out any spoilers, I wanted to ask, do you believe in ghosts?
Yes, I do. I do very much.
Yeah, it kind of operates as a parallel universe for this story, which I found completely fascinating.
I've always had an interest in the other world, and I remember my mum telling me as a child I had an imaginary friend that I used to talk to her about, but I can tell you right now he wasn't imaginary. I used to play with him and he was a great mate. I've always had an interest in the paranormal, and I wanted to weave it through the story she's living in an old house, isn't she? And so much has been going on in the past. That wouldn't be unusual. And I think we can, even if you're not interested in the paranormal, I think you can suspend your belief enough. I mean, let's face it, we all believe in time travel now, thanks to Diana Gabaldon, don't we?
Certainly do.
We can all believe in a little spook in an old house in England because of me.
Karen, in many ways, the war was the making of women at that time, in the sense that, as we've previously alluded to, they had to step up and perform roles that their husbands had previously occupied. The war definitely changed Jessie, but do you think it was the making of her?
Yes, I think it was. I think despite the fact that she lost her husband, I think she turned into a different person. She grew, she matured, she became independent, she became assertive, and, she met the German man and her life changed so much. But by the end of the book, I feel that she's just grown into somebody that she wasn't at the beginning. If you recall at the beginning, she's quite humiliated by an experience in the village. But toward the end of the book, that wouldn't bother her anymore.
Karen, what would you like most for readers to take away from this novel?
I think one of the reasons why I write these books is they're the sort of books that I love to read. And we all know that feeling when you close a book that stays with you long after you've closed it. The characters stay with you long after you've ended the book. That feeling as a reader, you can't beat that feeling. And for me, if people can read my books and have that feeling, that's all I need. It makes it all worthwhile. If people come up to me and they say, oh my goodness, your book, it stayed with me and I had to pass it on to my friend, and now we get together over coffee and talk about it. And to me, that is such a buzz. It really is a buzz.
I have a complete book hangover today. I'm going to be thinking about Jessica and Anton all day.
Music to my ears.
It was just wonderful. So, Karen, you're a member of Romance Writers of Australia. Can you tell me about your association with the RWA and how has it helped you on your journey?
Well, one of the big things that has helped me with the RWA is they have a writer critique program where what they do is, if you want to team up with another writer to work together, you fill out a questionnaire basically about your genre, your likes, your dislikes, and you put in an excerpt of your book that you're working on and send it off, and then they review it and they team you up with somebody who has a similar genre, similar style, similar, look and feel, everything. And I was teamed up with a lady called Maggie, who I've never met. She lives in Queensland. She writes romantic fiction, though contemporary. She doesn't write historical fiction. We worked together very closely on both Stormbird and one of her books called Champagne for Breakfast. I think the Romance Writers Association enabled me to do something like that, which I'd never even heard of. And now Maggie and I, we email one another and share ideas and thoughts. And to be a friend of somebody that you've never met is a really profound thing. That has been facilitated through Romance Writers Australia. The other thing too is they hold annual conferences, and very early on in my writing career I attended one of the conferences. Unfortunately I haven't managed to get to another one, and I was planning to go this year, but that's not going to happen. But the conferences are brilliant, and I got to meet so many people that I wouldn't have met, and sit in on workshops and learn new concepts and all sorts of things, and just to immerse myself with like-minded people. And I can't speak more highly of aspiring writers joining a society or an organisation like the RWA, like the Society of Women's Writers in Victoria or New South Wales, or, Writing Society, the Australian Society of Authors. All of these organisations are just invaluable resources for writers for everything, all sorts of things, and it's brilliant.
Karen, as a prolific writer yourself, what tips, other than joining associations as you've just mentioned, what tips would you have for listeners out there who are writing or looking to be published?
If you're writing and looking to be published, I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is not seeking professional editing. If you're a writer, you're keen to make sure you're doing it correctly. You've got your spelling, your grammar, your syntax, you've got everything down right. But there is so much that you miss. I've engaged an editor in the UK, and I handpicked her, even though my publisher has his own ideas about that. I still insist that everything I do goes through Jane first, because Jane is a very British lady. She's very upright. She understands my genre. She understands writing and book development. She's just brilliant. And she's worked with me on all 3 of my novels. And even though she's living in the UK, we do it all via Skype, and we workshop everything, and she reads through the books. And, I have to do maybe 4 or 5 edits, redrafts, before I send it to her, and then we'll do a couple together, and then it's ready to get to the publishers. So I can't emphasise enough drafting, redrafting, and then sending it off to a professional editor. But don't just take any Joe Blogs. You need to find somebody who's going to work with you and who understands your genre and what you want to achieve, what your message and how your book's tone is going to be. And I was very fortunate in finding Jane. I mean, she will tell me things that she doesn't want me to have, like she asked me about the Arms Up for Dippenbridge. She didn't like that. One of the other comments that she had for me, which I have to share with you, is my character Jessica, whenever she's shocked or alarmed, her go-to phrase is Lucifer's balls. Yes. And I remember when Jane was editing that, she's gone, "Oh no, we would never refer to body parts." And I said to her, "Jane, this is Yorkshire. I want Lucifer's balls to stay." So Lucifer's balls stayed, and I had a lady contact me via my website to tell me how much she laughed at Lucifer's balls. She thought it was lovely. Yeah, the bottom line is make sure you use a proper editor and, redraft lots of times and edit.
Karen, are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes, I've actually decided to deviate from my usual British theme, and I'm writing a book that will be set in the Victorian goldfields. And I'm embarrassed to say I don't know a lot about that. I mean, we all know about the Eureka Stockade, and we visited Sovereign Hill and what have you. I don't know an awful lot. So there's a lot of research I'm undertaking at the moment. I've started writing and the story's all there. I've seen the movie now in my head, so I need to get it down so that my readers can also see it. But to do that authentically, I need to do a lot of research. So that's keeping me occupied at the moment.
Fantastic. And I have to ask, will we see more of Jessica and Anton?
Don't know. I really don't know. I know a lot of people would like me to say yes. Look, you know what? I have actually thought of doing just like a little short story, just summarising okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I'll leave you guessing.
Breathless anticipation. Karen, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how could they do that?
Oh, look, you know what? I love hearing from people. I really do. They can get onto my website, www.karenturner.com.au, and there is a contact page there. They can email me through that. I would love to hear from them. Also, my socials, Karen Turner Author on Instagram or Karen Turner Author on Facebook. I honestly love hearing from people. So please feel free to contact me.
Karen, I'm so pleased to have discovered you and your incredible books. I'll be going back to read Torn and In Violet as soon as I can. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинеллис.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.